Morning, everyone, and welcome back to Alignment with Rebecca. My name's Rebecca McCarthy. I have a doctorate, a PhD in repetitive talk, actually, in sociology, communication studies, and also philosophy. And because I'm not able to really teach right now, I thought it might be nice to help us all find different ways in which we can align our lives so that we can live a better life and feel better and be happier and all that good stuff. Last time, we talked about communication, and specifically, we talked about what communication is and the different aspects of communication. And I thought because we are right in the middle of some major campaigns, that it might be a good idea to talk about things such as politics and propaganda this week. And I'm going to start it all off with this idea that we are not rational thinkers. I think when we listen to a lot of people on the political speeches and so on and so forth, we always hear you are rational voters and you're going to make the right choice. But we aren't. We aren't rational. We are emotional beings that tend to occasionally think. And when I say that, it's not a dig on you, it's not a dig on me, because I'm in the same boat as the rest of you. But really, we have to understand it is a combination of socialization, how we were taught to think, how we were taught to react, how we were taught to be enmeshed in our emotions. The fact that we're individualists, so we think a lot about I and me rather than us and them. And also our bodies. Our bodies are hardwired in such a way to take shortcuts. We really are. We are totally hardwired to take shortcuts. There's a reason why we often hear that kids need more sleep, that they need more quiet time, that they need better food and nutrition. And that's not only to help them, grow and become strong. It's also because that's the time in our lives where we are enmeshed in learning. And when we are actively learning on a very cognitive way, it takes a lot of energy in the body, it takes a lot of energy in our brains. And our brains tend to look for shortcuts. So our brain recognizes when we are in a similar situation that we have been in before. And it says to us to some degree, hey, this worked in that situation last time, let's just do that again. So we take shortcuts on many different levels. That's why we access our emotional being a lot easier than our cognitive, rational, or thinking being. And originally, if we looked at early politics and early democracies, if we look to the early Greeks and we talk about how they functioned as a democracy, they're often celebrated. I can't help but think of the philosopher Plato, who hated democracy. This man was not a fan of the democratic processes because he recognized that ultimately people are not thinking rational creatures. They're emotional creatures, and we often vote on our emotional thoughts and well-beings and reactions. That's why a lot of us are one-issue voters. If you are passionately against abortion, and you have a candidate who's also against abortion, but he has all this other stuff that you don't like, but he is definitely against abortion, you're going to look over all that other stuff. Even if all that other stuff is 90% of things that you dislike, you'll still vote for this person because of the one issue. And it comes down to the fact that we are emotional creatures. We are not thinking creatures. So I like to say we are emotional creatures with the capacity to think. And I think Plato got it right. I used to think he was wrong. I used to think he was full of bullshit, to be frank. And I think I've written a lot of papers on that. But over the years, experience has taught me that, he might have really got this one right. And it's interesting because when we go to the Enlightenment period, and I'm just going to my notes so I get the right dates because my brain is not a date kind of person. The Enlightenment happened around 1715 to 1789, give or take. These things are never exact. And we were living in a world with a lot of monarch type rule. We were living in a world where a lot of people didn't have a process in voting, in politics, in social decisions, and business decisions. And a lot of philosophers started to show up going, hey, listen, people can think, we have to give them the right to vote. If you go all the way back to Martin Luther, and when he pounded those 95 theses on his door, one of the arguments he was making, and it was a very important argument, that if you put the Bible into a vernacular language that the average human being can read, he or she can decide what this means for themselves. We didn't need priests to tell us exactly how to think. So there was this whole movement in the history of humanity where we started to argue against other people making all the decisions for us because we were rational, thinking human beings. And I'm not saying that we aren't. I'm not saying that, nor am I saying that biology determines everything. But what I am saying is that in general, because we have placed so much emphasis on our modern society, and yes, I'm putting the Enlightenment in the modern society because the thinkers that came from this point in time in our history, they really shaped what we have here in the United States right now. They shaped it in a very, very big way. And there are lots of issues about this. One of them, as I just said, was determinism, this idea that other people need to determine for us how to think, how we should function socially, how we should function within our classes, within different realms of thinking, such as, is it okay, do Black people think differently than white people, do women think differently than men, and the list goes on and on. So the Enlightenment really changed all this. It forced a whole reckoning of political and social structures all around the world, and we are still feeling it today. We really are. It's pretty darn amazing. So what's wrong with thinking that we are rational creatures? Nothing. And if we spent more time actually engaging in the rational processes of thinking, of looking for evidence, of looking for expertise, of really then questioning that expertise and then developing ideas that could build upon it, we would be fine. But we don't tend to do that. And I think there's a lot of things in our world right now that encourages us to take these shortcuts. So the internet is one. And I love the internet. You've heard me rant about it before. I used to think it was going to be the great equalizer. But the internet has been taken over by propaganda. And you might want to know, what propaganda is that? Is it these political groups? No, actually, I'm talking about advertising. And we're going to talk about that a little bit this week. But first, let's look at what happened in the Enlightenment, because I think it's helpful to understand why we function the way we function today, why we have the value system we have that we have today, and what may be wrong with these assumptions that have been brought down to us and actually immersed in our culture, immersed in our politics, and our social interactions, and what may not work anymore. It's okay to think that we are rational beings, but it's probably problematic if we suggest that we are most often rational beings and that we live in some kind of dualistic body. Our brain somehow is separate from our emotions or our senses. And of course, Descartes, I'm sure you've all heard of Descartes, I think, therefore I am, right? He really did change the world with that one statement, because what he did is he moved everything over on its head, and all of a sudden everybody was rational creatures because we think. And he separated his mind from his body in some aspects. And this is what we do today. We often think of ourselves as being dualistic. My brain and how I think can somehow be separate from what I receive from my senses and also what I receive from my emotions. And this isn't necessarily true. But what Descartes said really did change philosophy forever and change things to such a degree that we now have the systems and the beliefs that we have today. And of course, Descartes was coming from more of a mathematical background, and a lot of people in the Enlightenment, including philosophers, felt that in order to show that their philosophy, which is always, by the way, open to doubt, in order to show that it was fact, that they were coming to logical, rational conclusions, we have to set everything up as kind of like a proof, right? And this is in some ways all the way back to the Greeks again. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of the Socratic method of the questioning and answering. But in all of these cases, the assumption that we can find fact, that we can find absolute, is problematic, because when you're dealing in the realm of ideas, they evolve. They always evolve. And as William James once said, if we could know truth and it was actually truth, then everybody would probably recognize it as such. But as long as we are having these discussions and arguments about what constitutes truth, right, then we probably haven't landed on truth. Because if truth is what we think it is, then it would be readily recognizable by many, many people. Now, Thomas Hobbes, he was 1588 to 1679, so he's a little bit before the official Enlightenment period. He decided to take up on this idea of the social contract once again. So the social contract really is, how do humans function? How do they function in relation to free will versus determinism? And how do these things then affect our political realm and our political individuals? And a lot of things before this point in time was all about determinism, right? God determines what's going to happen to us, and we just have to listen to God because God has a plan. But by the time Thomas Hobbes came about, and also, of course, a lot of influence from the Catholic Church, this idea of free will started to become really enmeshed and separate from religious practices. So Thomas Hobbes was really a man about free will. But he didn't feel that our freedom should allow us to run amok, like go all over the place. So he really felt that we needed some type of central political system that holds people accountable for their actions and stops them from making a lot of bad decisions. Because for Thomas Hobbes, we are wild and crazy people, right? If we were allowed to be entirely free with all of our free thoughts and free actions, we would basically run amok. Cats would be sleeping with dogs. People would decide not to wear masks. Somebody could kill you in the street for your wallet. We need these laws in order to keep people on track. John Locke, who comes after Hobbes, 1632 to 1704, he was the father of liberalism. And I'm not talking about liberal social understanding, but liberalism in the sense of free will. And we see this with the Liberalism Party today, right? The Liberalism Party today says that we should have little government, that little taxes, that our free will should not be trampled upon, if you will. And this philosophy really did help the American Revolution in 1776 and also the French Revolution in 1789. So this idea that humans have a right to free markets, free wills, and that they shouldn't be placed under the will of others, this is kind of where we get this idea. And he also believed that we were all born a blank slate or tabula rasa, meaning that experiences that we have in our life informs all the knowledge that we have, that there's no divine knowledge that we come down to earth with, that we just start as a clean slate. And this is also where I like to throw in Voltaire a little bit. Voltaire was a prolific writer. He was a philosopher, he was a playwright, he wrote histories, he was an incredible guy, 1694 to 1778. And one of his most famous books, which you might have had to read at some point in your education, is Candide. And it is a satire that looks at the ridiculousness of certain philosophies. And it's also where we have a great section on how venereal disease is spread. So a lot of his writings also reestablish this idea that, we do have free will and we can make rational decisions. Again, this all goes back to being rational rather than emotional, that every human being is rational and we can think through problems, and we will think through problems rather than resting back on our emotional being. So David Hume, he's the next guy, 1711 to 1776. He was really influenced by Newton. Again, we have this scientific influence, this really major belief that we can be scientific thinkers. And he was opposed to Plato, again, who felt like somehow we came to Earth with divine knowledge, and our purpose was to rediscover that knowledge through experience. But he too felt more about free will, that human knowledge only comes from experience. Experience can be shaped by our rational thought. Our rational thought will then lead us to rational decision making. And then that brings us to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. He was a philosopher. He was one of the biggest misogynists I have ever been forced to read. His book, Emile, talks about the education of men versus women. He's very much separating people into little boxes and what their natural way of being are, and then making laws in some ways or social contracts in which governs those. Rousseau was really fundamental in helping shape the American Constitution. His ideas, his political ideas on how people were rational as long as they were in what nature had determined for them. So like women were made for men, very specifically, thereby women should not be voting, but should be taking care of their man. And if they take care of their man well, then the man is going to vote appropriately. So he had a lot of really enlightened ideas, and a lot of ideas which would land him today on the Jerry Springer show doing a DNA test for all the children he had fathered and then turn around and denied. All these philosophers, we always put them up on pedestals, but the truth is they're humans, so they're just as likely to fall to human foibles as the rest of us, and that's just the way it is. But what's important about Rousseau is, again, he promoted this idea of free will, rational thought, and our ability to engage in these processes, hence democracy. How democracy should work, or how we would like it to work. And the problem with all of these philosophers, and the problem often with democracy, is that we think that it should be a clean process, like a mathematical proof. We have this candidate say this to us, and we have this candidate say something different, and then we, as the voters, will take in that information and, like some kind of mathematical proof, will lay all the evidence out and then make a really rational decision. What Plato was correct about was that democracy is not rational. Democracy isn't about these perfect processes, and we as humans are swayed on a massive level by our emotions, by our belief systems, by our socializations, by the people we hang with, by the food we decided to have for breakfast, by the extra beer we had the night before. All of these things come into play, and they don't lead necessarily to rational thinking. Rather, what they lead to is emotional thinking. Democracy is chaotic, is massively chaotic. And it needs to be a chaotic process. But humans, we don't like chaos. We really don't. We like our structures. We like our routines. We like when we understand how things are supposed to go. And this is why, and this is what we're going to talk about more specifically tomorrow, this is why propaganda can take a hold of us so well. We can be the most intelligent. We can be the sharpest. We could have had the highest score in our classes. We may be the CEO of a company, the President of the United States, a candidate running for the President of the United States. It doesn't matter who we are emotional beings. And as emotional beings, so many things influence our ability to think rationally and to make rational decisions. So, propaganda, especially in a society like ours, where we are advertised to day in and day out, is a very familiar thing to us. It is so familiar that we don't recognize that it's happening. You know, it's interesting. When I grew up, and I was in high school, and even when I started college, and I'm sure it's pretty much the same way now, I was told that America doesn't use propaganda. And that was such a huge piece of information to give me because I believed it for many, many years. And I didn't even see how advertising itself is a form of propaganda. So when we are bombarded by propaganda from all sides, not just politics, but our everyday lives, we are constantly being persuaded to a particular opinion without allowing us the space to rationally think out the problems or decide to buy or not buy the next iPhone, even though 6 months ago I got the 11 and oh my God, the 12 is coming out. I've got to have the 12. See, we don't realize that we have been impacted by these different rhetorical techniques since we were born. And the better we can identify some of these techniques, and the more comfortable we can get with the fact that democracy and decision making and communication and everyday life is really a space of chaos. Once we get comfortable with those things, then we can start to think rationally because we understand where we are coming from. So tomorrow I'm going to talk about how there are several different techniques which are used on an everyday basis with us, that they are propaganda. We're going to start with advertising because that's the most common form of propaganda we experience day in and day out. And then we're going to see how these same techniques function in the larger world. But before we get to that, let's have a little meditation, shall we? I would like you to get comfortable in your chair. Just take a few minutes and take a deep breath. Kevin MacLeod is with us again with his elf meditation. I want you to breathe in deeply into the very bottom of the trunk of your body. When we breathe in, our diaphragm goes down. And when we breathe up, our diaphragm expands to get rid of all the air. Now, when we meditate, this is the opportunity to get past all those emotions that literally guide us day in and day out. Focus on your breath. Work at inhaling for a count of 5. Holding your breath for a count of 1 or 2, and then just exhale for a count of 5. Good. Now take a few minutes to focus on how your emotions lead you to decision making. How do you make most of the decisions in your life? Do you rely on a certain particular set of teachings? If so, identify for yourself what those teachings are and how they serve you in your life. Now identify how those teachings in certain circumstances may not serve you very well. Maybe you switch between value sets. Maybe they might be consistent in one area of your life. But maybe there's a different value set that tends to rule a different area of your life. Can you identify them? Now consider what changes you can make. Can you take a deep breath? Or maybe 5, like we're doing right now, before making a decision. Now simply let go of all those thoughts, all of those questions, and go back to your breathing. Wiggle your fingers, your toes, your nose. Gently open your eyes. And remember this feeling so you can recapture it later when you most need it. Thank Thank you very much for joining me today. This has been Alignment with Rebecca, finding different tools in our toolbox as we play in this great sandbox of life. Until tomorrow, aloha, mahalo, and namaste.